In 1943, a freshly fried churro in Madrid cost the same as a cup of coffee on any street corner. Today, that same piece of golden dough is sold in over 100 countries, from a street cart in Mexico City to a booth inside a theme park in Tokyo. But before becoming the best-selling street dessert on the planet, the churro had to cross an ocean, change its name, and even shift its intent. And the story of how it got here is way stranger than you think. It all starts, surprisingly, very far from Spain. More than 1,300 years ago, during the Tang dynasty, street vendors in Chinese cities were already frying long strips of dough in huge cauldrons of boiling oil. They sold them at dawn, wrapped in paper, to workers heading to the market. That dish, known today as Youtiao, had a crunchy texture on the outside and a fluffy inside, very similar to what we look for in a good churro today. But behind that bite was something darker than a simple recipe. Popular legend says the original name of this food meant something like fried in oil, referring to a corrupt official who, according to history, betrayed a military hero dearly loved by the people. The furious locals began frying twisted dough figures representing that traitor as a silent form of protest, which eventually became a custom and later an everyday food. Imagine for a moment those streets from over 1,000 years ago. The smell of hot oil mixed with wood smoke, the shouts of vendors announcing their goods, and the lines of workers waiting their turn before entering the grain markets or textile workshops. The fried dough wasn't a whim or a celebratory dessert. It was, above all, functional food, cheap to make, easy to carry, wrapped in leaves or paper, and capable of filling the stomach of someone facing a long, exhausting workday. Curiously, that utility is something the churro would keep for centuries, long before turning into the festive treat we associate with fairs and celebrations today. That fried dough would have stayed locked away in Asia for centuries more, if not for some sailors with a serious appetite for business. During the 15th century, Portuguese traders established one of the first permanent trade routes with China through a small port in the south of the country. There, according to a widely circulated theory among food historians, those merchants first tried the fried dough local street vendors offered. Fascinated by the technique and unable to replicate the exact ingredients Chinese cooks used, they started experimenting with what they had on hand on their ships: flour, water, and salt. The result wasn't identical, but it was close enough to become its own dish once they returned home. Still, not all historians agree with that version, as another equally fascinating theory places the birth of the churro not in a trading port, but in the most isolated mountains of Spain. For generations, shepherds living in rural areas, far from any bakery, needed a simple way to make bread without an oven. And the solution was frying a basic dough of flour and water directly over their campfire. To shape it, they used an improvised mold that reportedly resembled the curved horns of a sheep breed called Churro, which is right where they say the name we know today came from. The word churro would still take quite a while to appear in writing, as the first documented records of the term in Spanish cookbooks and dictionaries aren't found until well into the 18th century. Several generations after shepherds and merchants were already making and eating this fried dough without giving it a formal name. Before that, the dish simply circulated as fried dough or elongated fritter, depending on the region. This small detail reminds us of something important about popular food history. It almost never gets recorded the moment it's born, but much later, when it has become so common that someone finally decides to write it down. Whatever its true origin, by the 18th century, Spain had already become the land where the churro found its definitive form. And it was right at that moment that the second major twist in this story happened: the arrival of chocolate. During the Spanish colonization of the Americas, ships sailing back across the ocean to Europe didn't just carry gold and silver. They also brought cacao seeds, a crop native Mesoamerican peoples had been cultivating and consuming for centuries as a bitter, spiced drink. The Spanish adapted the beverage by adding sugar and cinnamon, and hot chocolate soon became an exclusive habit of the aristocracy. Almost 2 centuries would pass before someone had the idea to pair that thick drink with the fried dough shepherds and merchants had already been making for generations. When it finally happened in the first chocolaterias of 19th century Madrid, one of the most beloved pairings in global gastronomy was born: churros with chocolate. By the time that combo caught on, frying churros was no longer an improvised trade, but a job with its own set of rules. In several Spanish cities during the 19th century, guilds of churreros were formed, organizations that set sales hours, controlled the quality of the oil used, and, above all, decided who could officially call themselves a churrero. Becoming one wasn't easy. It required years of apprenticeship alongside a master, starting with simple tasks like stoking the fire before you were even allowed to touch the piping bag used to shape the dough. Many of those vendors worked through the night and early morning, frying before dawn to have churros ready right as the city started waking up. Over time, that quiet, nocturnal trade became one of the most cherished and respected professions in the Spanish urban landscape. Before continuing with this story, if you're enjoying discovering where the foods we eat every day actually come from, this is a great time to hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel, because we still have an important part of this journey left. So, let's keep going. Because while the Madrid aristocracy enjoyed their thick chocolate in porcelain cups, the churro still held, at its core, a much humbler origin. For much of the 19th century, those selling churros weren't owners of elegant cafés, but street vendors who hit the pavement before dawn, hauling portable fryers on wooden carts. They sold to market workers, fishermen returning from the port, and laborers just starting their shifts. The churro, fried in hot oil and dusted with sugar, offered something those workers urgently needed: fast, cheap calories to fuel 12 or 1 4-hour days. In that sense, the churro served a purpose similar to what industrial foods would later fulfill. It was the cheap fuel of an economy that demanded bodies constantly on the move. But the story of the churro didn't stay locked inside Spain for long. Through colonization, trade, and waves of migration to Latin America, the recipe crossed the Atlantic a second time, and in every country where it set foot, it transformed. In Mexico, vendors started stuffing churros with cajeta, a type of caramel made from goat's milk. In Argentina and Uruguay, the preferred filling became traditional dulce de leche, even served inside alfajores. In Chile, the local variation is called manjar. And in Peru, a close cousin of the churro emerged known as the picarón, made from squash and sweet potato, drenched in chancaca syrup. Each country took the same basic idea, fried dough and sugar, and turned it into a unique symbol of its culinary identity. But the Spanish colonial route didn't end in the Americas. It also crossed the Pacific to the Philippines, where the churro mixed with local pastry traditions that existed long before the arrival of the Spanish. There, a variant known as traditional fried dough was born, thicker and less crispy than the classic churro, usually coated in a thick layer of sugar and served as part of afternoon tea. A custom Filipinos also inherited from contact with Spain. To this day, in markets and fairs across several Philippine provinces, you can find vendors offering this local version, proving that the churro didn't just travel, but allowed itself to be shaped by every culture that welcomed it. Now, all this growth would have been impossible without a decisive technological shift. For much of its history, churros were shaped by hand, a slow process that limited how many units a single vendor could produce in a day. That changed with the arrival of the first churro-making machines in the late 19th century, mechanical devices with a process star-shaped nozzle that allowed dough to be extruded continuously and uniformly. That nozzle wasn't just an aesthetic choice, either. The ridges of the star increased the surface area in contact with the oil, making the churro crispier on the outside and fluffier on the inside. With this innovation, one of the oldest and most renowned chocolaterias in the world was born in Madrid in 1894, a shop that continues serving churros, using the exact same recipe it opened with over 130 years ago. There was also a particularly tough period when the churro proved why it had survived for so many centuries. Post-war Spain. Between the late 1930s and the 1950s, with the economy devastated and basic ingredients rationed, many families couldn't afford meat, fish, or even white bread every day. But the churro recipe, stripped down to its bare essentials, barely needed flour, water, salt, and a bit of oil. 4 ingredients that, even in the hardest times, could almost always be scraped together somehow. The churreros of that era unwittingly became a sort of informal food support network, offering one of the few accessible sources of caloric energy for working families in the cities. In more than one neighborhood, stories are told of children waiting in line with a small coin in hand, knowing that no matter how bad things were, there would always be a lit churro cart right around the corner. And this is where the story takes another turn you probably didn't expect. In the mid-28th century, the churro crossed the ocean once again, this time bound for the United States. In 1955, just days after the opening of a famous theme park in California, one of its food stands started selling churros as part of its street food menu. The combination was an immediate hit, an easy treat to eat on the go, perfect for a family exploring an amusement park for hours with no time to sit down for a meal. From there, the churro became a staple at fairs, carnivals, and amusement parks nationwide, eventually becoming a constant presence in shopping malls and urban food trucks. But the real global explosion of the churro arrived just a couple of decades ago, driven by something neither Spanish shepherds nor Chinese vendors could have ever imagined: social media. Starting in the 2010s, videos of churros stuffed with dulce de leche, smothered in melted chocolate, or turned into ice cream sandwiches started going viral across digital platforms. Fast food chains launched special editions of stuffed churros dipped in seasonal sauces. Churro-flavored milkshakes popped up, alongside churro-shaped donuts, and even coffee with churro syrup. What was once a humble homemade fix for isolated mountain shepherds transformed into a global trend powered by millions of posts and shared videos every month. And here's something most churro lovers prefer not to think about while enjoying one. An average churro in a typical serving can easily exceed 300 calories, not counting the chocolate it's dipped in or the sugar sprinkled on top. Part of that issue isn't just in the recipe, but in how it's fried. For decades, food safety studies in various countries have pointed out that many street vendors reuse the same oil for entire shifts, sometimes for several days in a row, to cut costs. Repeatedly frying at high temperatures degrades the tond of UBBHA oil and creates compounds that, when consumed regularly, have been linked to cardiovascular issues. No vendor is going to tell you that while handing over your bag of warm churros. But it's a quiet part of this story. The very same frying process that made this dessert possible for 1,300 years is now the subject of warnings from nutritionists around the world. Current figures back up this expansion. It's estimated that the global churro market currently moves several $100 million a year, with a confirmed commercial presence in over 100 different countries. From small street carts to international dessert chains, the official record for the world's longest churro exceeded 1,000 meters in length, crafted by a team of pastry chefs who worked uninterrupted for hours to pull it off. And in countries like Spain and Mexico, churro consumption spikes, especially during the cold months of the year, when eating something warm, crispy, and sweet becomes almost an emotional necessity alongside a culinary one. In Mexico City alone, it's estimated that several thousand stands and carts operate exclusively to sell churros, many open from before dawn until late at night. In Spain, some chocolateria chains have managed to export their business model to over 20 different countries, replicating the same centuries-old recipe born behind the counters of Madrid. And in the United States, during peak months at theme parks and fairs, a single venue can sell tens of thousands of churros in a single weekend. Numbers that 1,300 years ago, no street vendor from the Tang dynasty could have ever imagined for their simple fried dough. What makes this story fascinating is that, regardless of which theory about its origin holds true, the final result speaks to something deeper than a simple recipe. The churro was born out of necessity, the need of Chinese vendors to offer something cheap and fast at dawn, the need of Spanish shepherds to bake without an oven in the middle of the mountains, and the need of urban workers to find enough energy to power through exhausting days. And from that necessity arose, almost by accident, one of the most beloved and recognizable desserts in the entire world. If you've made it this far, you're probably enjoying diving into the real origins of the foods we take for granted every day just as much as I am. Before you go, I invite you to leave a comment telling us your favorite way to eat a churro. Remember to like this video if you learned something new, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because behind every bite we take without a second thought, there's almost always a journey spanning centuries, continents, and people who never imagined how long their invention would last. See you in the next one.